recording.
Oh
Hello,
yeah, brother.
hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Actual Play broadcast. We're doing something a little different. This is actually, I don't want to call it a masterclass, but it
I call it
is,
masterclass.
yeah, it is our two takes on running games, be it they are short term, long term, even one shots, but just tips and tricks and what it's like being a GM overall. We are giving this advice because we know that typically this is a scary point for a lot of people to start. Is everyone in your group's like, yeah, let's play a role playing game, and it's just like, well, who's going to run it? Um,
Yeah, that and it's a question that's always being had. There's not really a point in the community where there's not new GMs coming into the fold or a player who's wanting to make the switch over to running something for themselves for the first time, and then they realize, oh no, I actually don't know anything that goes on behind the GM screen. What
yeah,
do I do? Even though they may have played the game for, in some cases, years, and they just haven't been a GM, and they just don't.
and it's one of those situations where, like, if you jump into it with no preconceptions, not looking anything up. Not saying you're doing it the hard way, since we live in a world where the entire index of human information is available at your fingertips, but you definitely you could learn a thing or two just by looking something up. And
Mm-hmm.
we're hoping that this could be something that is found and that could be looked upon, and advice given and followed. Uh,
Absolutely.
or you could completely just ignore anything that we say here and, go, what a bunch of chuckle fucks. I'm not going to
Yeah,
stop you.
that's the important takeaway for like this series on a whole is like this is us giving our thoughts and opinions and methods and our like tips and tricks and all that we do. That said, game mastering, dungeon mastering, whatever you want to call it, running a game, there's not one there's not one tried and true solved method. It is something that will never be quote unquote solved. It whatever works for your table is what works for your table. And that can look wildly different from table to table. For example, I know a big one for our tables as opposed to other tables. If you listen to actual plays and stuff, or you're involved in the community, you've probably heard a lot about like X cards or safety tools. Our tables generally don't use safety tools, but we also have the atmosphere where if we have a problem, we say something
Yeah.
and we talk about it. So we don't need safety tools for our table, but that
Yeah.
might be different for other tables
Yeah,
where they
that's
might
like,
decide they might even be familiar with each other and can have those conversations, but they may decide to still use them just for ease of dealing with those things. So it's you know if you don't if you don't agree with anything we say, sure, I guess. I feel like we're going to cover some things that are objective truths, but we're also going to have opinions and stuff. So at the very least, if you don't agree with everything we say, I'm sure you will find something of value to take away from this series of recordings that we're going to be doing.
and ultimately, that's just kind of the goal, is to have something that folks can take away from this. Uh, and one of the first things I think we do want to discuss is picking out a system.
Yeah. The Now, granted, in a lot of situations, people kind of already, if they're already starting with a group, they may already know what system they're going to be playing. Commonly these days it might be D&D 5th or some other system that is fairly popular. And the question might be, well, how do I run this game? But we also know that there are people out there who, our group has played this game or whatever, we want to play something else. What should we play? Or we're getting into tabletop games. What should I run for my group? Or some variation of that question of, we want to do this, but we don't know what game or system we want to run with. And as part of prep, knowing what system you're running with is a big part of that, because that can actually heavily influence how you prepare for running a session or a whole campaign of your game.
Yeah. And prep is going to be the main thing we talk about in this episode. And when it comes to picking out a system, you have, well, there are tons of options. But the first question you need to ask is, what am I running this for? Am I running this for a one shot? Is this going to be a one and done, and everyone's going to walk away either having had a good time or like give a first impression? Are you doing a short little like series? Like, are you and your friends at like a hotel for a convention or something, or out on like a road trip, and like you want to have a session every night, and you want to have that be like one continuous story? Then there are some systems that are just better for short form content and don't exactly lean themselves to epics. I would consider Old Fair to be our epic adventure that we're having.
Oh yeah, we have scraped the outer edge of it.
Yeah.
And that's definitely one of the first major questions you do want to be asking is, what is the scale of the game? For me personally, I kind of mentally break them down into like kind of three categories. You've got like your one shots, which sometimes aren't necessarily just one session. It's very common for somebody to plan for something to be a one shot, but then, and this, in my experience, comes from sometimes a lack of game sense or underestimating player involvement. Where, yeah, this should be doable in a one shot, and hypothetically it is. But then once you actually get into the game happening, it's now like, oh, we're going to need like at least 2 sessions, maybe 3, to get through this little adventure. In which case, that's not really a one shot. It's what I like to call is just an adventure, where it can be a limited set of sessions.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be a one and done like a one shot is supposed to be. And then you have the full on campaign, and how long a campaign is can be, I mean, in some cases it might be 12 sessions, in other cases it might be, 36 or 50 or 100 or 300. You hear about people having campaigns that last years and they're meeting every week. And those are definitely your campaign scale stories.
Yeah. And some systems lean themselves very well to being able to operate within that. Some are not so much. For example, D&D Pathfinder. Immediately, I think of those two, and you could definitely make those into long form campaigns. They have very well guided and very much like pre-established. Like, this is like, you're going to start at point A. The next stop is like the next level or the next point in the adventure. So planning that out and having it naturally progress and there be this constant sense of progression, not difficult.
Yeah, they don't, as systems, they don't give you a lot in when we're talking game master tools. And like just going forward, I guess I should just say, I'm probably just going to default to saying GM.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're talking about game master, or if you're new, that's what GM is short for, is game master. It's the non-branded dungeon master terminology, as I believe historically there were issues with people using dungeon master as a term, so people moved away from it. But systems such as D&D and Pathfinder, while there's a lot of community content for giving you recommendations on running longer form campaigns, if we're talking what the systems themselves do, they don't do a lot to give you information on how to go about it. But you do have this framework in the rules, as Brandon is saying, where you have a very clear point A to point B. You've got this level 1 to 20 progression. And it is looking at the rules for how experience or milestone XP and stuff like that goes. You can see this is not going to be a short game if you want to tell that level 1 to level 20 story. There's not a way to condense that into a one-shot adventure. Not without getting like really avant-garde with it. You know what I mean?
It starts getting wild.
Yeah. And honestly, you don't want to try to do that. You don't want to try to cram that into as short as a frame as possible. That said, some systems like D&D and Pathfinder, you can find ways to do one-shots or short adventures with them that are not necessarily hard to do. It just comes with caveats. For example, a common way of doing a one-shot or short adventure with D&D and Pathfinder, because of their longer format, is to design your adventure around a concept for what level you want your player characters to be for doing that adventure. And when you get everybody together to come to the table, you have them make characters at that level instead of going through the whole leveling process. So if you want to do an adventure that you're designing around players being level 6, because for whatever reason level 6 sounds great to you, you would design that adventure around level 6. You're not worrying about rewarding them XP, because when the adventure is done, it's done. And they're not going to level up, because that'll be the end of these characters. And they come to the table, sit down, and they make level 6 characters. And that's a way you can do that. So you have some flexibility there with a system like Pathfinder or D&D. But then you've got other systems like, for example, using something we've used on the show, the Alien RPG. Longer term campaigns, while doable, are not a strong suit of Alien. Alien is designed to capture the essence of the storytelling from the films. It's a lethal system that leads to character death. So having a recurring cast of characters that have good chances of being from start to finish over 12 sessions is just not feasible.
Let alone like trying to go into the hundreds.
Yeah, you're not going to have the same cast of characters by the end that you started with. Somebody might get lucky and get a long way through, but they're eventually going to bite it. And you want examples of that? Go listen to the Alien podcast. We had one person of the original squad make it out, and I'm not going to say who it was. That was 5 episodes. That was 5 sessions. Yeah. 5. 3 players. And I think it totaled out into 4 character deaths. 4 and the death of a couple NPCs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But it lends itself much more to that one-shot short adventure setup and scenario. And like we said, it doesn't make it impossible. It's just you're going to have to do a little bit more legwork. For example, one of my favorite systems is the Call of Cthulhu Delta Green systems. Those have rules for long-term play, but long-term play is not adventure epics that span well into like the 30s. It's usually 12 is what it expects, and they have pre-built scenarios for that, but you can make it work, or you could do different storytelling tricks to kind of continue that along. Multiple generations of individuals encountering the same mythos or handling the same objects of power. You can make it work. It's just not the typical format. And just like not the typical format, other games that lend themselves to long-form storytelling, such as look at anything by White Wolf or Onyx Path. They do not have that same linear level 1, level 2 progression. But
Yeah.
the way that the game is structured is it's structured very much around the idea of you being able to do these long form campaigns.
Yeah, they do work good for shorter games too. I don't know if I'd really run a one shot using a World of Darkness or Onyx Path game, except some Onyx Path games work better for one shots. They have an entire series about copying like B movies
Yeah.
and mechanics that emulate that, and it's hilarious. I haven't played them, not a ton of interest in playing them because it's just not really my shtick. Um, but hearing them describe what gameplay can look like, hilarious. I love it. For people who enjoy that kind of thing, go nuts. Me personally, not my thing. But a lot of their game lines are very focused around very character driven story. Taking the quintessential example from White Wolf, Vampire the Masquerade. Very character driven story. You're playing as characters that are vampires. You know, that is a lot of personal drama, baggage. How do you deal with being undead, living in a modern world, blah, blah, blah. You can tell a short chronicle, as they call it, a short adventure or campaign that can span 10 sessions. And maybe that's the end of your chronicle. Or you can just be like, we going for the long haul. We're just going to see how this goes. And you just run it for as long as you want to run it for. Because they do have, and like this is the other part of these systems when you're trying to decide for what kind of length you're looking for, is reward systems for players. What does progression look like? If I play my character for 5 sessions, is my character going to grow in that time mechanically? Not all systems necessarily do that. Some systems that even do lend themselves to longer campaigns don't necessarily give you significant mechanical gains for playing over long periods of time. But most do because, well, these games come out of both wargaming and inspirations from video games and stuff, and we kind of have this intuitive sense of if I'm playing a character and I'm going on all these adventures, certainly I'm going to get better at doing stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of people intuitively think that way. Even if they're not consciously thinking about it in that way, they're kind of expecting to get better at things. So when you are running something long form, that's why you see a lot of people going towards D&D or Pathfinder or like White Wolf / Onyx Path stuff and other similar titles that have these experience systems and ways of growing your character mechanically. That's not to say character growth as a form of like the fictional growth of the character as a form of reward and progression doesn't matter. It does. But for every player who does like that and prefer that and doesn't care about the mechanical growth, there's going to be a player who wants the mechanical growth.
Specifically.
Yeah, like me personally, if you gave me a system and was like, we're going to play this for 2 years, your character is not really going to change mechanically in those 2 years. I'm not going to play it. I don't want to commit 2 years to no mechanical character growth. It's just not really the type of game I'm interested in. So that's something to think about. And you don't necessarily, if you're just starting out, you don't need to sweat bullets about this.
No.
But it can be something aware of. Like if you do want to jump into a long-term campaign, is the system I'm going to pick going to allow my players to grow their characters out? Because that is also going to affect how you run things. If you're running a system that doesn't allow your characters to mechanically grow, and you think you're going to have a big boss battle at the end that is super powerful, and certainly the characters will be ready for it by the end, you might be setting them up to die at the end if there's not a real progression system. So it's something to be aware of when you're preparing and choosing your system as part of that preparation.
And one of the things to also now this next tip for like picking out a system is very subjective, but I know it's something that pops up with our group fairly often. When you are looking at a system, the level of complexity of the system will matter. Now, the two of us have very strong opinions on how complex a system should be.
Yep.
But again, that's an opinion. And your play group may want something that's super, super simple. And you gravitate towards things like Powered by the Apocalypse or Fate. Or you want, we want the standard like mid-core, the stories that our no, it'd probably be grandfathers at this point that our grandfathers have talked about for like when they played tabletop role-playing games if they did. Or the games
Teenagers that were playing AD&D are if especially old enough to have their own kids. So yeah, it could very well be grandpa.
Yeah.
And I mean in high school or graduated already kids.
Yeah. And at that point you're probably going to gravitate towards things like D&D and Pathfinder. Or maybe you are like us here and it's just like I want a crunchy system. I want something that has a lot of mechanical depth and a lot of mechanical freedom.
And the way I put that is I want a system that I can sink my teeth into. I want something that's going to let me really customize my character. I don't want to play spreadsheet simulator. I don't want to be sitting here just looking at rules 90% of the time. But there's got to be something there for me to work with, or I'm going to get bored.
Yeah, which is an issue that if you go back and listen to our Daggerheart review is something that we ran into. We go into detail about our qualms with the system. But it was a playtest, so maybe it will change.
Yeah. And this is, I think it's important to note, this is something that system taste in regards to like light versus mid-core to crunchy, this is something that is really, first of all, it has a potential of changing over time.
Yeah.
When you start the hobby, your opinion may be one way, and then 10 years down the line, your opinion may be another way, and 10 years after that, it may change again. It does not need to be part of your identity and a hill you have to die on.
No.
It's like your taste buds. It might stay the same for your whole life. It may change. As a kid, you might have hated broccoli. When you're an adult, hey, broccoli's actually kind of badass. These things happen. And that said, it's especially starting out, if you have no frame of reference on tabletop RPGs or you've only played D&D, like I know there's a lot of people out there, they started on D&D and they've been playing nothing but D&D. And at least at this current point in time, now we're seeing people, I don't want to say en masse, but we're seeing a lot more people being like, okay, we're tired of this. What else is out there?
Yeah.
Some of it is going to be trial and error for you and your group. If you're first time or you've only played D&D, because the reality is the tabletop gaming sphere is vast and varied. Granted, if you go to the rules light end of the spectrum, there is a lot of stuff out there. And don't misconstrue that as there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's a lot of stuff out there. Some of it is good, some of it is bad.
Yeah.
But on the far end of things for crunchy, you're going to find a lot less of it. But when you do find it, it's thick. It will be thick.
Yeah.
There will be a lot to bite into.
And that's not to say that the other end has only good things either. I can immediately Riffs. If you look up Riffs by Palladium, Palladium can make good games. Riffs, I just don't think is one of them. It is a very, very, very mechanically dense system. I think the primary book that I had access to was like 700 pages. So you're paying for a textbook. Mind you, cheaper than your average textbook.
Shout out to Mage the Ascension.
Oh God.
It's another really thick book.
Yeah, but like, I don't want to say Shadowrun is the crunchiest system that we play, but I think that is correct. We play Shadowrun 5th.
It's definitely crunchy. It is what some people would call a simulationist. It does not try to perfectly encapsulate the real world, but it does like, do you want rules to rig an explosive to a vehicle and like set up a car bomb? There are rules for that. That is something like 90% of systems would not try to create rules for. They would, if anything, they'd be like, well, here's the rules for like creating a bomb. And then
Yeah,
you just make a knowledge chest to place it correctly or something like that. And Shadowrun gets a little bit more into the weeds with it.
it gets a lot more in the weeds because if I'm correct, it's like, oh, did a bomb go off in an enclosed space?
Yes, chunky salsa rules.
Yeah, chunky salsa rules.
Yeah, Shadowrun has a lot of rules. It's a lot of rules, and that's the other thing is when it comes to running your games and you're choosing your system, there is always the argument for house rules and homebrew. If a system you pick up, say you pick up a light system and you feel like there is really this gaping rule and it's kind of impacting your play experience, but you like everything else about the game, you as a GM are empowered to step in and be like, we're going to add this rule or make this slight change so that it works better for our table. The cops are not going to come kick in your door. The game designers aren't going to ban you from all of their social media or some shit. Um, you're free to make that choice. And most, if not all, I only say most because I'm sure there's probably one book out there at least where some guy was like, you have to play my game specifically how I wrote it. Just because there's got to be somebody with that kind of ego out there.
Yeah.
But most game books will outright tell you, as a GM, you have final say. That's rule 0, as it's called in the business. You, as a GM, can change things as need be. So if you have a rule system that you have a pain point, you can adjust that pain point, and there you go. You have a crunchy system, and it's like, man, the rules for this one thing are way too fucking dense. We don't even care about that aspect that much. You also have the ability to just condense that and like hand wave it stuff. I do it in Shadowrun all the time. Where do we really need to sit here and worry too much about going through the rolling process for this? No. Let's shortcut it, simplify it, or just not call for any rule engagement at all. Handle it in a very fictional sense that is within the universe without need for mechanical involvement of the system itself. And we can just move on. And that's kind of a skill you'll just pick up over time to just figure out what matters in the moment versus what doesn't. Early on, a lot of people will want to very heavily attach themselves to the rules, and a lot of new GMs do that where they don't know the answer to a question for a rule, and they end up spending 10 or 15 or more minutes finding answers for those rules.
That slows down gameplay.
Yeah, and if you and your group are fine with doing that, you're not in any rush, and you do just want to do things by the book. Maybe it's a tense situation, and you want to make sure you do it right so you don't feel like you're cheating your players or whatever. That's all totally fine. This is always the objectively correct way to handle things like in fiction if you're not sure about a rule. Like, sometimes you might want to do things differently. But it's a good thing to know and understand that you as a GM have that ability where you can adjust things on the fly. The biggest thing is when you make these kinds of, if it's going to be like a long running change or a way of doing things in whatever system it is you pick, you just need to make sure you communicate that with the players.
Yeah.
Like if I sit down and I'm playing D&D and I know I'm going to have exploration as a very core element of my game, and part of that is going to be, rationing food and water and supplies and stuff. I may, at our session 0, tell everybody as they're making characters, like, hey, there's going to be a lot of exploration in this game. Because of that, as a DM or GM, I'm going to house rule Goodberry is not a spell you can take. Some players will be mad by that. You know, it's a really good spell, but it eliminates the dangers of a survival situation in a lot of ways. And if you're making a very survival focused game, you may decide, no, I don't want that to be an option. All you have to do is you have to make sure your players are on board with that. Now, of course, that might become a discussion. Maybe your players don't agree with that, or they don't want that to be taken away. Which I think would really bring us into the next major point for picking a system is figuring out what system is actually going to work for what kind of story it is you want to tell, and working with your players to figure out what kind of story it is you want to tell.
Yeah.
If you're thinking, I want to run D&D and I want to have this very exploration, survival-focused game, but your players heard D&D and they're thinking, we're going to be badass heroes dealing with like high-level inter-kingdom political intrigue that is going to result in us unveiling a doppelganger plot or like fighting a fucking dragon or something. Your expectations are not meeting up, and
that will cause
clearly
friction.
Exactly, and you need to communicate. So talk to your players.
Additionally, some games are very ubiquitous in what you can run in them. Others are not. Not saying that you can't try, but D&D, not exactly a game that lends itself to the horror genre, for example. But it's not impossible to do. It's just, you as the GM have to put in more legwork. There are some systems that are just completely incompatible with other ways of doing things. For example, Call of Cthulhu. You are not going to run a noble, bright adventure using the Call of Cthulhu system.
Yeah, if you think you're going to pick up Call of Cthulhu and you go, oh, Cthulhu is this big bad evil god that you're trying to stop, and you think that the adventure for that is we kill Cthulhu, you're wrong. That being said, you try to run Call of Cthulhu in D&D, you're going to have a hard time. D&D and Pathfinder can be scary. You can have horror as a theme, but if you want to explore madness mechanics and other things like that, it's not going to go smooth because the system isn't really designed for that. Especially 5th edition. 5th edition has even less rules for handling that kind of thing. Whereas Pathfinder, there are ways to go about it. It's still not my preferred way to run horror, but it's doable. And I say that as somebody who has some arguably horrific shit going on in Old Fair.
I mean, the scenario is horrific. It's not. We are disturbed by how fucked the situation is. We are not disturbed by the setting.
Well, that is a type of horror, though.
You're not.
And that's the thing. Is like you can have a horror scenario within D&D. It's just if you're trying to run a purely horror game in D&D, you're gonna have a bad time because D&D is a combat game. You can run other things, but it's a combat game. You're gonna have a big bad monster. It's gonna have HP. Your players are gonna be able to kill it. But that's also if you give the monster HP. So that's a whole other discussion.
That's an entirely different discussion.
Yeah.
And so when picking out a system, it's just like to kind of go over the spark notes before we go into the next topic. Figuring out how long or what kind of adventure you're trying to run, whether or not it's going to be a one-shot, an epic, or a short. Figure out if the rules are something that you believe you and your players will be comfortable utilizing or believe will enjoy. And then
and for the rules, don't let something crunchy put you off. If you sit there and you're like, you look up Shadowrun because we mentioned it, or you've heard about it before, and you hear the system's very crunchy, there is like a light version of the system called Shadowrun Anarchy. But if you do want to run just one of the proper editions or run 5th edition like we're running because it sounds cool, but you're intimidated by the rules, honestly, just don't be. You don't need to be a master of the rules for whatever system it is you pick up on session one.
No.
Part of the hobby is picking up systems and checking them out. And as long as you're communicating to the players, like, look, I don't have this book memorized. We might have to open it a few times during the session to look at rules, and that's fine. If somebody really has an issue with that, they need to calm down.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a group activity. Have fun with it, and it's a learning process. You can't be a master of something without doing it first.
And like just overall, the system's rules are a guideline. Don't be afraid to change or bend them as long as you are consistent about those changes and bends.
Yeah.
Because the first thing players notice is inconsistencies.
And it will drive them insane. I will say, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I was playing with a GM for a Vampire the Masquerade game. Love him to pieces. He's great. There was a point in time where there was a player felt like there was consistency issues in regards to how a certain power worked. And it led to some friction and a lot of arguments that happened after the game because they felt like there wasn't consistency when it was really just it turned out to be a communication error because of a somewhat language barrier. It just there was a little confusion there, but a lack of consistency can lead to a lot of frustration because it can feel like you're constantly changing things that might be screwing over the players. Maybe not intentionally, but so if you are going to change things, just be consistent about it. If you're going to change a lot of things, maybe have like a notebook or something, or a reference sheet or whatever that's noted down all of the changes. Or if you're playing on Discord, have a channel like, hey, here's all the house rules that you can always go back to and double check. Do something so it's codified.
Then going into the concept of doing prep. What is prep work? What constitutes as prep work? I would say
Staring at a blank note document for 5 hours, I would say, is prep work.
I don't think that's necessarily productive prep work.
No, but it's a type of prep.
Uh
It's bad prep.
but prep work is anything that you do before a session to try and either organize or create ideas of where the story or the adventure is going before session starts and without your players necessarily being fully aware of all the details. You can absolutely still prep with like not like revealing your entire plan to your players, but it's just like, hey, are you guys cool if you start going on a sea adventure?
Yeah, and like this kind of ties back to talk to your players for what kind of story they want to tell.
Yeah.
That same token, if you've got somebody who's like can't handle like ocean shit, they've got like real bad thalassophobia or whatever, and they don't even want to have it in the game, maybe don't run a pirate story.
Yeah.
But yeah, you wanna know that going in for one to help you pick your system, but then also when you sit down to do your prep, they have an idea of what to start prepping. If you're going to do a political intrigue, who's involved? Who are the key players in that political intrigue? What do they want? Who do they hate? Who do they love? You want to be thinking about all these things. You want to have these things prepared ahead of time instead of just finding out as we go.
Yeah.
Because you might be caught with your pants down in that regard.
Yeah, it's just doing prep it's not a necessity per se, but it's what separates generally like I can't think of a single like there's definitely times where like things that I have improv has become like mainstays in people's minds. But there are the things that you prepare and that you take the time to craft usually help tell a better story. And as this is a collaborative storytelling experience, it's usually the thing that sticks with people. My example of this is when I was running Ars Magica. Shout out to anyone who knows what the fuck that is. I was running Ars Magica and I created a power system that the bad guys had, which was referred to from then on as the Civ system, in which power from a demon was distributed among all of its followers, and every time a follower died, it was put back in the Civ and redistributed among all the cups. So, and that stuck with people to the point where I had one of them mention that they used that concept in one of the games they ran. There are things that you can prep that can help craft really good stories. There are things that you'll have to improvise to help make sure the story goes along. But there is such thing as too little and too much prep.
Yes, very much so.
You saying that a GM is an improv artist, I believe, would be accurate. You do not want your entire job to be improv.
Yes, improv is a very, very good skill to have. It is, if you've not, I hesitate to say trained, that almost sounds too formal. But if you've not had improv experience before, you're going to get it playing tabletop RPGs. It doesn't mean you have to be like a top tier actor or whatever, but improv is shorthand for improvisate. Oh, fuck me, never mind. But it's a type. It's derived from a type of acting where when I was taking acting classes in school, um, we would some of our improv assignments would involve us standing in front of the classroom. We would have one of our other classmates at the front with us. The teacher would give us a prompt, and that was how the scene started, was the prompt, and we had to figure out on the spot, only if like 10 seconds given to us to think, who are we in this scene, or at least initiate or say so and so is starting the scene, and you're going to respond to whatever he says, and that's going to be your position in the scene, and now you have to go through this scene.
Yeah.
And I remember one of my first instances of doing this, my teacher had me and one of my classmates go up, and she's like, all right, I'm going to say Tim was his name. Not actually, but we're going to call him Tim. And they're like, Tim, Zach here has just rear-ended you at a stoplight. And that's all we had to go off of. And it went from him going, what the hell are you doing? Blah, 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 blah. And I ended up was like, okay, so I'm the guy that hit him. I have to figure out like make up an excuse for why I hit him. And then try to like smooth it over. Be like, oh, your car's a piece of shit anyways, just get it replaced or whatever. And he's like, no, your car's a piece of shit. And it like turned into this whole thing. And I mean, when you think about it, when you're playing tabletops, people are acting on the fly. As a GM, it goes a little bit beyond that of just acting on the fly, because you might be in a situation where if you're playing in your own setting or a setting you're not super familiar with and you don't know the answer to something, you might have to come up with an answer on the fly because you didn't think of that. A player might erroneously ask, wait, all these goblins are living in this cave? Where do they shit? And now suddenly you have to have an answer, potentially. Or you're going to say, I'm not answering that question.
Yeah.
You could. But now your players are going to obsess about it, because that's how players are.
The number one thing that you'll improv, and I promise this is a promise, names.
Yep.
Names of
Here's my
places,
hack.
of people.
Here's my hack. Name generators.
Here's my hack.
There are some great ones out there of all types. Google them, you will find them. But do not be afraid to use them. Even if you're just taking a name from a generator and then change it slightly. That works too. But name generators, chef's kiss. They help so much.
Here's my hack. Grab one of the many books that you have access to and look at the credits. Pick a name.
Oh,
Or
fair. That's a good idea.
Or if you are a mad lad like me, you just start throwing fucking syllables together.
Yeah.
So, like there are times where it's just like, Brandon, I need a name. It's just like Aston Ashworth. It's not a good name, but you have a name.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Names. always needing a fucking name.
yeah.
It's like the players are going to talk to an NPC you didn't expect them to talk to, and they might, for whatever reason, decide to ask what their name is or who they are and whatever, and you're just going to fill that in. And now that guard that was literally just set dressing is now Johnny. He's struggling with his marriage. He's got 5 kids, barely enough coin from this guard duty job, and he's really just hoping he'll even have a chance of surviving to retirement. And sometimes that's just how it goes.
That's just how it goes sometimes. Names of places. Luckily, if you're playing within the fantasy setting, a tavern is usually something related to drinking. So the tipsy, the wobbly, the drunken, blah 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 blah, and then a fantasy creature or something in fantasy. The wobbly knight, the tipsy mermaid, shit like that.
Yeah, treat naming a tavern like it's fucking Mad Libs. Adjective, noun.
Done.
There you go.
Because it's harder to look up. Like you could get a name generator for that too, but that's harder to like for me to. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna pick it up out of a book.
Yeah, that's that. Aside from name generators, there are some really phenomenal random generator resources out there in like book format and all that. That have like tables and stuff you can roll on. Where if you're not in a session but you're doing prep and it's like, I want there to be a really like cool tavern or whatever, but you have no idea what you want to do for it. There's resources out there that have tables and charts and stuff for generating these things. There's a entire great series of books here on my shelf. They're
I have several of them as well.
Yeah, sorry, I had to reach over to grab one. They're the Game Master's book of insert thing here. I haven't gotten a chance to read all of them and go through them all in detail, but a series of books filled with different things. They have like decent ideas for like depending on what the book is about. Like if it's about traps, they'll talk about designing traps and stuff like that, and they'll have like good insights for running traps in your game, as well as some pre-made ones, ways for generating things. Like the one I just grabbed off the shelf is the Game Master's Book of Villains, Minions, and Their Tactics. This is one of the ones I haven't gotten to read yet, but it has information for some pre-written villains and all of that, as well as tips and stuff for making your own villains, as well as actually like running enemies, because that's a big thing some GMs struggle with on the prep side to a degree. Some of it's prep, some of it's in the moment, is running your enemies. How do they behave? And that extends for your NPCs too. How do the non-player characters in the world behave? Are they going to fight to the death? Why? Oh, they're not? Well, why is that? What's their priority in the situation? For example, running Altfair, when the players ran into the Dire Lions. The Dire Lions were looking for food. They found the players. They're living things, but they're weird. They're not familiar. Is it food? Well, we don't know. They're curious animals. So they're going to look. They're going to try to find out. And while it could have turned into a fight, it didn't, because they ended up getting scared off. Because their priority was curiosity, because they're animals. And then when that curiosity seemed too dangerous, they fucked off. Meanwhile, you might have villain type enemies that you may feel are willing to fight to the death for whatever reason. That's something to think of as part of your prep for when you are, especially when you're actually coming up with like enemies and not just random encounters with wild animals. What do these enemies want? If you're playing Shadowrun and your players are going to break into this office building and this office has security, what do the security officers feel about working here? Are they getting paid enough to really risk their life? Are they going to go out of their way to stop the Shadowrunners at any means necessary? Or are they going to make it look like they're making an effort and just lay low because they don't want to be in a news report later?
Yeah.
And they want to go home and see their wife and kids.
And there are tons of resources out there. Some books provide like their own resources. Some of those resources take some experimenting to get used to. For example, if you ever work with the challenge rating system of Dungeons and Dragons, you'll notice that is not the most consistent thing.
Yeah.
But there are people out there who have hard, like, attributed values to how combat functions. I have to find, I think I have a bookmark somewhere, but this individual made an entire setup for understanding like power scaling, and it's just like how the power scaling actually works based on damage outputs, how much HP someone can handle, whether or not a debuff can be applied, things like that. And like it's very detailed, and it's a lot more difficult than grabbing like, here's the average player level versus the CR of the creature. But that difficulty is like generally, in my experience, because I've used it a couple of times, have led to better results. Other resources out there, let's say you want a dungeon, but you don't know the foggiest idea how to go about making a dungeon, or how to mark a dungeon on a map, or how to necessarily go through that. donjon.bin is great. Donjon is a great resource.
DONJON.
Yeah.
.bin.
.bin.sh, I think. Yeah. But this, I don't know if it's an individual, but this site has so many things you can generate, including name generators in there.
Yep.
And it's not just for like 5th edition. You have things for Pathfinder, for Micro Light 20. I don't even know what that is. And just being able to create these randomly generated dungeons, and all you have to do is download the file. And some of these files, if you're just looking for a layout, you can get that no problem. But if you wanted to, it's just like, I know that this is going to be a dungeon. I know that it's going to have undead creatures, but I don't have a firm grasp of all the creatures in the bestiary. This will absolutely help you do that. It is a great resource, especially for when you're first starting out and you're not like necessarily sure how to annotate things on a map, or if you're even making maps, because you can absolutely do this theater of the mind and just give descriptions. But I like to think a lot of people are visual learners and absorb information better visually, which is why the entire virtual tabletop space exists.
Yeah, if your method is going to be theater of the mind, you just want to keep that in mind when you are going to have a dungeon or some kind of exploration of that nature. To make it, because let's be honest, a lot of these dungeon generators, well, in general, let's be honest, the D&D concept of a dungeon, architecturally, makes no goddamn sense.
No.
There's no reason for dungeons like that being designed in such a way, outside of gross incompetence. So that said, when you are designing with theater of the mind in mind, you can simplify things and keep things much more reasonable instead of winding passages that connect to dead end rooms, and it's less of we're going to go into this underground building and check out what's down there and more of a labyrinthine maze to navigate, because that's what traditional D&D dungeons are these labyrinthine mazes filled with rooms that have different kinds of monsters and traps and maybe treasures, which can be a fun experience, don't get me wrong, but theater of the mind, not a great idea, because people are going to get confused and they're going to get frustrated. But you keep it simple, keep it straightforward, but you could have a decent dungeon run doing theater of the mind. Just make sure you know where everything is, and if somebody needs a clarifying question, you can answer that fairly quickly. So don't overcomplicate it.
And that's where we start getting into that too much prep. What is too much prep? Well, that line is easier. That threshold is easier to cross than you might think. If you are the kind of person who enjoys, or not necessarily enjoys, if you're the kind of person that preps and plans for various outcomes, and I don't know, maybe you're fucking Batman. The amazing thing about an improvisational storytelling game that you're doing with your friends or loved ones is they are likely going to think of something that you did not think of. So congratulations,
110%.
congratulations. You prepped for 90 things. They found the 91st.
Look up Murphy's Law. It's the concept that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. So if you're going to sit here and you're going to heavily plan everything out and just be like, oh, well, if I have everything planned out, nothing can surprise me. Everything will run smooth. Oh boy, you're going to be fucking surprised, because they will certainly do something you do not expect them to do. For example, they're going to go in this town where they're going to be able to shop, get what supplies they need. There's going to be a tavern for them to stay in, and then there's going to be a rogue that is going to attempt to break into their tavern room and rob them, taking like the MacGuffin they're carrying, and it will lead them on a chase that will lead them to this thing to unveil. But then all that goes out the window, as while they're shopping, they wanted a discount, the guy wouldn't give it, and it turned into a physical altercation, and now they've been thrown out of the town.
And or arrested.
And now all that planning and setup you've done is potentially out the window, because you had a very specific idea of what was going to happen, and you only prepared for that. That's too much prep. Even though that may not be actually a lot of prep, at least for some people, that's still too much, because you've over prepared on the assumption that this one thing is going to happen. And now you are dead in the water with what happens next, because you didn't think about them doing that. Another example of too much prep, I knew somebody who did this. They said, if I plan out all the major plot points of the campaign ahead of time and then start the campaign, filling in the small things will be easy. And they did that for like a month. And then they started running the game, and we had 2 sessions, because they were already burned out. They were already tired of working on it and dealing with it. They pretty much spent all of their free time, well, not all of it, but most of their free time working on this for a month. They burned themselves out on it. They got sick of it, and they couldn't handle running it. That's another example of too much prep. Because realistically, you don't need to prepare for something that is going to be months worth of game time down the road. When I prep, I have a vague notion of what's going to happen next based on the time scale of how the game typically goes. Which, for somebody who's new to this, might be a little scary because you don't know what exactly your time scale is going to look like. But I'm a bit more experienced. I have ideas on and feelings, as well as knowing my players. That's a major part of it. I know how my players are. So I can have a sense of, I need to know the big sticking bullet points for what's going to be happening over the next couple days, and then I need to have vague notions of what's happening over the next month. And I can generally handle the session I'm going into. I can't go too much into details of examples because those would be spoilers, because the most immediate examples coming to mind are Aldfair things, so I can't talk about that too much. But let's make an example. No. We'll use some Aldfair examples. As part of using this Kingmaker system, I understand that there are Kingmaker turns, so I kind of have a small bullet pointed list of some events that will happen in relation to those things over the next in-game month. And then, depending on the current situation the players are in, I have some ideas of how they may handle things and how various characters and influences will respond to those things. And instead of sitting down and doing a very heavy, detailed list of, well, if they do this, this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, I already have it prepared of, well, if they say something that's going to upset Roderick, or they're going to do something that Roderick is diametrically opposed to, this is how he's going to feel about it. And then I also conceptually, because Roderick is a mainstay NPC at this moment, I understand to what depths Roderick as a character is willing to go to. Is he willing to lead a rebellion? Does he prioritize following orders? And that's where the improv comes in. I don't need to know what exactly he's going to do if the party pisses him off. I need to know who he is as a character and how he might respond to different things. And from there, I can piece together with his motivation, what is he going to do? So in Aldfair, Roderick values human lives. Well, people, I should say, because it's more than just humans. But he values keeping people safe, keeping them alive. If the party decided, we're going to go evil, and we're going to start doing blood sacrifices every full moon, because reasons, whatever those reasons might be, he's going to have a problem with that. And he will try to talk them down. And if they won't see reason, he would likely try to kill them himself. Or if he was in a situation where he knew that he wouldn't succeed, he would see about organizing a rebellion. Because that's who he is. That's a hill he is willing to die on.
Yeah.
And I don't need to plan that. It's in response to what the players do based off of what I know about this NPC that I made. And honestly, sometimes I make NPCs and I don't necessarily know what exactly their motivations are, and it comes forth through emergent storytelling based off of what happens. And I just play the character as a GM, and it just naturally emerges and takes form on its own without me specifically sculpting it ahead of time. Now, that might be a level of improv that is too much for some people, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It is a way of going about things, but you need to be able to trust in your improv skills if you're going to do that. Otherwise, I definitely recommend, whether you actually write down a bullet point list or you kind of have it in your head if you can keep track of it, whatever works for you. If you're making mainstay NPCs and other things like that, and just in general, NPCs aside, with the world in general, bullet point lists of if X, then Y, and have a vague idea of what that looks like. What are the immediate effects? And then at least be thinking about down the road, because, shit rolls downhill. What could potentially happen? Because realistically, from session to session, you're not jumping huge amounts of time. Most games, very likely, are literally day to day. Most games that I'm aware of do not have significant time skips where they're skipping like a couple weeks ahead. So, if you know the party is going to like piss off a lich, you don't need to know exactly what the lich is going to do tomorrow. Because realistically, it might take time for the lich to find out. And it will probably take time for the consequences of that to come to fruition. So you can sit there and say, as a GM, I'm going to take a note. The party did X, which is pissed off the lich. So now they're on the lich's radar, and the lich is going to do something about it. But it's not going to be this session. May not even be next session. It might be 10 sessions from now. But you've taken a note. You know something has to come of it, and you can continue the session as normal. And then when the session is over, and you have the time, you can start planning, okay, what is the lich going to do? What's the move? So if there are things you do need to plan, or you want to have consequences to things, you don't need to have a response to that thing right this very instant.
Then I
You
feel
just
fine.
need to have enough that you can kind of get by, in a sense. Not by the seat of your pants, but,
And I feel fine, like, talking about my method that I'm using for Eclipse Phase, because this will have come out by the time a number of Eclipse Phase episodes have come out. A lot of what I do for planning plot is, especially if you're having a more freeform game where you have a point A, but you don't necessarily have a point B, and you want the players to make their way to a point B. Because you can absolutely do that. It's very sandboxy, and that's perfectly fine. You want to throw out plot hooks. You're fishing. You're going to put out these hooks, and the players are going to grab some. And the ones that they grab are the ones that you develop. You can have the other ones if you have the time, but like those time is marching on for those other plots as well. But those aren't a concern of yours at this moment, because those aren't the ones the players are holding on to and going after. They're going after these hooks. So you throw out these plot hooks, they grab onto a few of them, you start pulling that in, start trying to develop that, see what you get out of it, see if any of the lines break, see if they get to the end of one of those story progressions, but by then you're putting out another hook already. It's all this constant, like, hey, here's this interesting thing I have an idea for. Do the players want to do it? Here's a plot hook for it. Do they grab it? Yes. Cool. I can start developing that and fleshing that out more with maybe an endpoint at some point if they keep a hold of it. Or maybe they're like, I don't care about this anymore. Like, we think we've done our part, and then they'll go and grab something else.
When you're doing these hooks, you don't want to over prepare these hooks either. Like Brandon was saying, you want to give them something to latch onto. So what you really want to do, you want to have an idea of what's the start of the hook. So what is the actual hook itself, and have notes for if they intend to take this hook. What is the middle? What are the conflict points? Like, what are the kinds of things that are going to happen? If they're going to go into the dungeon, is it going to be riddled with traps? Is it going to be riddled with monsters? Blah, blah, blah. You could potentially figure that out later, but just at least understand what's going to be in this for whatever the hook is. Because you don't want them to take the hook and be like, oh, I didn't think you were going to take that, so I didn't prepare anything. No, have an idea of what that middle looks like. And then what are some potential endings that you think are going to shake out? but don't marry yourself to any of them. So if the hook is, oh, there's a magic there, rumor has it there's a magic sword in this dungeon, and you decide, oh well, there's going to be like a bunch of traps. It's like an abandoned tomb or whatever. They go in there, they overcome some of the traps, but turns out, maybe this magic sword is actually cursed, and they figure out it's cursed before they find it. And then they decide to leave. That's probably an end date scenario you didn't prepare for. So if you sat there and were married to the idea of, well, of course they're going to take the sword, well, now you're SOL. They didn't take the sword. But have a rough idea of how's it going to start. What does the middle look like? What is the potential end goal?
Yeah.
I guess I could use the example from Shadowrun, since this is going to be a while after that episode aired. The hook is Johnson calls, I have a job for you. Well, what's the job? There's this lady. We need to take her off the streets. The people want her to go away. And I have a client who's paying for her to go away. You're going to get paid for it. And you just have to get rid of her and drop her off at this point in time. And there's more details to it, but then, like, the middle points are, okay, she has this routine. I know enough about her that I don't need to know the exact routine ahead of time. I can fill it in as we play, and I make sure I take notes for what her routine is as we play, so that I can refer back to whatever the fuck it is I said, because I'm probably not going to remember otherwise. And then one of those middle bits, one of the twists that I've decided ahead of time, she has a dockwagon contract. If some funky, hinky shit goes on, dockwagon may show up to come retrieve her and render medical aid. And then, of course, her routine generally involves her being around people. And then, end result, they turn her in alive, they turn her in dead, they don't turn her in at all, etc., etc. Or they decide to ditch the job or whatever. And I don't plan super ahead of that, because I know that first session is probably going to be a lot of the prep for doing the job, and then I know that second session is going to be dominated by actually doing the job, if not finishing it. But that second session, it was finished, and we got the results of it, and then I present another hook. Now, what do I do if in that first session they don't give me a hook? Well, and be like, okay, well, I thought you guys wanted to be Shadowrunners. You're pretty low totem pole, and you're going to be picky choosy about your jobs. Okay, like, that is a choice. You can do that. I'm not going to stop you from doing that. So if they decide not to take the hook, what do? I turn around and I pull out random generators, because I really didn't fucking think they were not going to take the hook, because it's session 1 and they agreed to play Shadowrun. Let's go on a baby's first Shadowrun. But I can pull up generators, because even for Shadowrun, there are generators for generating a Shadowrun on the fly. You're going to be doing a lot of improv work, but it's an option. Or you can just pull something out of your ass. Or it could be like, okay, you're going to spend some time asking around for work, but nobody's necessarily going to come to you with work. So what do you want to do in the meantime? And now it's on the players to decide, well, what do we do with our downtime, because we didn't take the hook? What are we going to do? Because that's the other thing. There's a degree of prep that you do, but there also has to be a level of agreement on the players to actually take the hooks that you're going to be providing. Because if you sit down and you had that conversation, and the players were like, yeah, we want to do political intrigue, but then you start like dropping the plot hooks for the political intrigue and they're not taking them, then maybe it's time to have that conversation of like, I thought you guys wanted to do this. Why aren't you getting into it? Like, what's the problem here? And maybe the plot hooks themselves aren't good, or maybe they thought they wanted to do that, but they really didn't, and what they actually want is something a little different. But either way, they've agreed to play the game. And so If they say no to the plot hook, that doesn't mean the game just ends. That means the players are doing something else now. And like I said, that's where the improv skills are going to come in. What is that something else? And maybe it's a little slice of life RP, you know? Maybe that's what the party really needs sometime. There's just some time to sit down and shoot the shit and do whatever. Because that can be valid too. And the best part about that stuff is you do not have to prep for that. That can just happen.
And I think that leads to the next part is how do you avoid burning out as a GM? Because you're sitting here, you're doing all this prep work. Maybe people aren't exactly playing the way that you thought they were. Maybe there's some conflicts that are happening on. Maybe there's scheduling issues, so these games aren't happening as often as you'd like. There's a myriad of reasons why you could be running into burnout. Maybe you're just like not enjoying. You said that, yeah, sure, I'll be the GM of the group, and as you go through it, you're just not having fun. It's more work than you like. That could be a matter of maybe just GMing just isn't necessarily for you, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, complicates the playgroup a little bit. But let's say that's not the case. Let's say that you are having fun, but you find yourself too busy or there's just too much going on. How do you avoid the burnout? Well, that is a tricky subject. As both me and Zach here have definitely had our own fair share of burnout, it's not always something that can necessarily be avoided. Sometimes you need a break. What that break looks like is up to your playgroup. If you have someone else in the groups that's like, you know what, I want to try to GM a game, then congratulations,
absolutely.
you've instilled someone with the itch. The good kind of itch, not the bad kind. That's one of my happiest moments as a GM is being told by other players that I had in my group. It's just like, I started GMing, or I want to look into GMing.
Yeah, there always needs to be more GMs. Is the unfortunate nature of the hobby is there's never enough GMs. There's way too many players, not enough GMs.
Yeah,
I shouldn't say there's way too many players. There's not enough GMs to fit the demand that the amount of players create.
that's why you have those people that do get paid to GM.
Yeah,
because economics, supply and demand. You have supply, there's a demand.
Yeah, and as part of the burnout, it's important to note, and I'm kind of kicking myself because I should have said this at the beginning, since this is going to be like episode 1 of the series. GMing is a skill, and what I mean by that is some people may have a good, intuitive, natural sense for it. Some people may need to spend more time working at it to really get good at it. But like with anything else that is a skill, you don't need to be naturally talented at it. If you put in the effort, you will be good at it. Sure, it will take time. Sure, you're going to make mistakes. But every GM makes mistakes. Literally every GM. There is no such thing as a perfect GM. It is something you're constantly learning. And in my opinion, if you are not actively, to some degree, looking for ways to improve, you're going to stagnate and you'll probably be like, okay. But you're not getting that constant improvement. You're not getting better. You're just doing okay. And you don't necessarily need to be actively like looking up books or whatever and like doing all this reading online and spending hours upon hours of research. But at the very minimum, this is my recommendation. At the very minimum for continuing to grow your skill as a GM is at the end of a session, ask yourself, what did I do wrong? What did I mess up? Or not even necessarily what did I do wrong? What could I have done better? Because it may not even necessarily be an instance of you necessarily doing anything wrong. There are a lot of times situations where what you did wasn't wrong. It's just like, man, I actually have a much better idea looking back on how I could have handled this situation. That would have been so much smoother, so much simpler, or would have been better for the story. And that's not you doing something wrong. It's just, hindsight is 2020, and when we improv, we're in the heat of the moment. We can't sit here and take 20 minutes to contemplate every action when we're playing a game. Because then we're not playing a game anymore. Unless it's like, we're playing diplomacy, but that's different.
God.
Um, so I say all this because if you are somebody who is thinking about being a GM, but you are not sure yet, my message to you, if you take nothing else away from this podcast, you should take away, just do it. You are not going to get better at it until you do it. And I've said this before in one of our other recordings. You will make mistakes. You will do things wrong. You will make errors, so on and so forth. But you have to run games. You can sit there and listen to every podcast about GMing under the sun. You can read every book about GMing under the sun. You can read the endless forums about running games under the sun. But at the end of the day, nothing is going to prepare you for running a game outside of actually running a game. You can conceptually understand a lot of stuff, but when it comes to sitting down in the GM chair and running an adventure, nothing can replace that experience. So that is your most powerful tool, is when you finish a session, evaluate with yourself. What did I feel like I could do better? What did I feel like I can improve on? Stuff like that. And it doesn't necessarily need to be immediately after the session. You can let yourself decompress, relax, think about it at a later point. And chances are, especially once you get more experienced, you'll automatically start doing it inside the session, where you'll do something one way, and then like 5 minutes later, you'll be like, I should have done that a different way. I do that from time to time. So, as part of like the extension of connectedness, why does this matter for burnout? As part of the GM skill set, you need to not be excessively hard on yourself, because that is something I see a lot on forums and such, is new GMs who don't think they have the skill, they don't have the ability or whatever, or they think they have to do a ton of prep and it's just too much work and so on and so forth. And they beat themselves up with all these reasons why they can't do it. And they end up effectively burning themselves out on the idea of it because they are overdosing on all these negatives instead of just being like, I'm just going to do it. It might suck, it might not. And worse yet, some will turn around, they will have that first session, and they'll say, that went horribly. And you just never run again. And as like a formerly quote unquote gifted child, we gotta stop doing this. I have to be perfect at it or not do it at all bullshit.
Yeah, no shit. I feel that. I'm
You
bad about that.
You can't live like that. You can't GM like that. You are constantly growing as a GM. There is no stopping it. You have to accept. Like, I'll be the first one to tell people, the first games I ran sucked ass. And not in a fun way. It was awful. Like, one of the first games I ran was literally RPG horror stories material. All right. It was that bad.
One day we'll
And
have
it
a
wasn't
podcast for that.
entirely because of me. It was a lot of it was because of players, but it was also on me because I, as a GM, I had not both between like what the year was and then also my lack of greater experience with just the internet and such and looking to know about these things. I allowed that sort of environment at my table to exist. So it was partially my fault, but also other people are shit. So it like even the people who are giving all this advice for running games, 9 times out of 10, they fucking sucked at it at first too. So don't burn yourself out on being like, I can't do it, I'm shit or whatever. Self-evaluate. Better yet, talk to your players when a session ends. All you have to do is a simple comments, questions, concerns, be honest, but don't ask them to be honest if you can't fucking handle it. All right?
Yeah.
If you're going to break down in tears over feedback of them being honest, they're not going to want to be honest with you. If they're not going to be honest with you, you're not going to get the feedback you need. So, like, be honest. Or set them up to give you things that you're looking for. Like, how did you feel when X? Or what did you think about Y? Or what was something you really enjoyed about this session? Was there anything about the session you didn't like? Don't say, what did you not like about the session? Or what was the thing you disliked the most? Don't say that. Because now they're going to look for something and they're going to feel like they have to put something there. When the session might have been great all the way through. And that means they have to pick their least favorite part out of all the great stuff, which is going to make you identify a problem. And it's going to continue to feed into that, God damn it, why do I suck type of mentality.
Yeah.
Just be looking for ways to improve. And you're already halfway there.
Just simple comments, questions, suggestions. Everyone have fun. I think, pretty sure I end every session that I run that way. And I expect everybody to give honest feedback. I'm still going to be self-critical, and it's just like that didn't go as fast as I wanted it to. There were some problems. I spent too long trying to find this rule, and those are things that you have to self-evaluate for. Most players, especially if they haven't been behind a GM screen, aren't going to say, "Man, it took you 2 minutes to look at that rule. Should have had that in under 30 seconds." No.
They can shove their foot up their ass.
Yeah.
I like, if I'm going to give a hard limit on how long to look at a rule, 5 minutes. If it ends up taking more than 5 minutes, make a decision as a GM if you really want to keep things moving, or if it's that dire, then you can go past that 5 minutes.
Like, it's like, how does death work in this system? You probably want to find the answer to that.
Yeah, that's one of the things where hopefully you know how that works before the game happens, but I understand sometimes it's like, fuck, I wasn't expecting death this soon. Alright, let me double check how this, because chances are when you reach your first death in a game, you're probably going to want to double check anyways.
Yeah.
Just to be sure.
Or
because that's not something you generally want to fuck up the rule on.
Or some systems handle death weirdly.
Yeah.
For one reason or another. I think death in Wraith is a little wacky, isn't it? Same thing with Mummy.
But you don't really... Death in Wraith is a little complicated. You don't die in the traditional sense in Wraith because you're already dead. You kind of... You get... I think they call it discorporation or something like that, but you're temporarily fucked up. And you kind of reform at a later point. Death is you giving up all hope, and it's like coming to oblivion. And that's, Wraith is a very good game. Go check it out. It requires a level of emotional maturity. If
Correct.
You're going to run it, it is a very dark, gut-wrenching type of game that is... It's not for every table.
No.
A lot of people bounce off of it because of what it is. But yeah, Mummy also, death is only permanent if your character has essentially given up on their will to live. Otherwise, they keep coming back. Mummy's very cool. Also, check out Mummy. Highly underrated. Very good game.
But those are two examples like where death isn't just death. It's like you hit 0 HP, you die. That's not how those two systems work. So those are something that you like looking up when you pick up a system. How does death work? Strange thing to think about. Like
Yeah.
at a macro standpoint, it's just like, what the fuck do you mean? Death is death. Well, in most systems, you are correct. Death is death. In other systems,
And
there are
then
things attached to it.
some systems don't have rules for death at all. Which,
We won't,
depending on how you feel about that, may or may not be a problem.
we won't name those systems yet.
No, we will not.
But
If you know, you know.
Daggerheart had rules for death that were weird, like just not dying being an option, but you like take you take a penalty permanently, or a blaze of glory, things like that. And there's usually death is not cut and dry in a system, and you will have to look something up. But I think talking about player death and character death, well, not player death, talking about character death is something else that could be reserved for another conversation.
Yeah. Which I think, kind of bringing it back to avoiding burnout, that's one of my suggestions is depending on the system you have, you can get burned out just from
Prepping.
There are some GMs who, well, prepping, yes, but also as part of that prep, there are some GMs who insist on knowing all of the rules before they run a game. Stop it.
Just stop.
Just stop it. Unless you're talking one-page RPG or something super light, where it is very feasible. Like if the system's got like 5 core rules, obviously you can memorize 5 core rules. That's not hard. But if you're talking about something like D&D and you're like, I need to memorize all the rules, stop. No.
No.
You know, as part of system mastery that happens over time, could you reach that point? Yes. Should you force yourself to? Absolutely not. That's what the rulebook is there for, is for you to reference it. It's not something for you to memorize. So there are instances of people getting burned out from forcing themselves to try to remember these rules, and then once again feeding back into that. I can't remember the rules. I'm a shit GM. Blah 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 blah. No, stop. Relax. It's not that serious. If your players are forcing you to operate at that level, you need to have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
For example, and I make a point of this very specifically for crunchy systems like Shadowrun. Shadowrun has several different like rule sets that I refer to as subsystems inside of the greater rule system. My requirements for players, and as a GM, as sort of a dynamic for running Shadowrun, if you are playing a magic character, you need to understand the basics of magic as a player. As a GM, I need to understand the grander scheme of things in general. I need to understand the key points of these different subsystems, but I do not need to know all the details. I do not need to know all the spells from the magic system. I don't need to know all the stats for all the different spirits. I don't need to know, all of these different small things. If the player is going to be summoning a fire spirit, they should know what the stat template for the fire spirit is, or at least know where to find it. And so when their spirit makes an attack roll, I can say, okay, how many dice are they rolling? How many successes do they get? And the player can handle that. Because it is too much to ask for one person to memorize all the rules. Now, playing Shadowrun as much as I have, a lot of shit is stuck in my brain. But it's also been a long time since I've played, so some of it is kind of in the haze of other systems. But do not burn yourself out on trying to study the rulebook. Get the important shit down. What is the stuff that you're rolling most often? How are challenges handled? If you're running a very fiction forward game that does not call for rolls for everything, you should know when are rolls called for in that system. In D&D, when is the appropriate situation to call for perception versus just telling somebody something, which realistically would be
Is it in the open? Is it obvious to see? Okay, they don't need to fucking roll for it. Um, and okay, well, I know I have to roll. Obviously, you need to know how does rolling work. Are you rolling d20? Are you rolling 5d6, 3d6? Is it variable
Percentile.
based off their attributes and skills? Like, know the basics, understand how the game works. Make it so that the moment to moment asking for rolls or handling an attack, whatever the meat of the game is, you want to know enough that you don't need to keep pausing in every other action to be like, well, how does this work? How does this work? So obviously, read ahead, but don't kill yourself trying to memorize the whole thing. So that's another sticking point for people getting burned out, and also stopping themselves from jamming because they think they need to know everything. You
You
don't.
don't. Um,
Nobody even knows all the rules to Monopoly. Get a grip, people.
fuck.
Deep cut.
It's just, I had 6 different flashbacks, all at once, and all of them were terrible. I
That's why
hate
I said it,
Monopoly.
because I think anybody who's playing a tabletop RPG has probably played Monopoly before and has had that experience of nobody at the table can agree on what the rules are.
If I land on go, do I get double?
Double what? You don't get anything for landing on go. You get it for passing go.
there is a common house rule that if you land on go, you get 400, not 200.
Yeah. Wow.
Because you did it perfectly. Neither here nor
Yeah.
there. This is about
Yeah.
tabletop role playing
Back to-
games, not
yeah.
a terrible game made by
Back to
Hasbro.
burnout. The other thing for burnout, obviously, is the actual prep itself. Planning out your adventure and stuff. Doing the too much, you're going to burn yourself out with too much. That was my one example I gave earlier. GM planned way too much. Way too much. Way before he needed to. And he was sick of the game before it really even started. I mean, we got 2 sessions in.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Madness. Do not do too much prep. If you're doing so much prep that you are scheduling out several hours out of your days and you are just hating it and it's not fun, you're doing too much. Scale it back. Because to a degree, some people think of the prep as work. A lot of the GMs I talk to get enjoyment out of prep. Realistically, prep should be, to some degree, enjoyable. Sure, sitting down and writing notes is not fun. Even authors will tell you writing the book is the worst part about writing a book. Like, yes, the work part is not fun. However, if you're not having fun doing the basic fucking planning, you're going to be in for a bad time. You might be planning too much, or maybe this specific type of game you aren't jiving with. And that is a very real conversation to have. If you're trying to run Dungeons and Dragons and you're really just not jiving with it, you don't like the type of stories that you have to tell in it, or you're not enjoying the prep with it, and it's not that you don't dislike GMing, but you're not enjoying this part of D&D, it might not be a prep issue. It might not be a you issue. It might be you with the system issue. And you may not be jiving with it, and you might need to switch. And that's the other, at least the last one that's coming to mind for me is the system burnout.
Yeah.
There is a very real case of people who get locked into playing one system, and the most common example of this is D&D because it just is the most popular. And there are a lot of people who they pick up, especially 5th edition, and they don't want to play anything else. They don't want to learn any other rule system. They're only playing 5th. And as a side effect, they end up trying to cram all kinds of things into 5th and all this. But anyways, the point is there are people who play this nonstop. And eventually, players or the GM, and I see this a lot more with GMs, get sick of playing it. They get sick of running it. And they're like, I don't know how to talk to my players about this. What do I do? I'm sick of playing this. My players do not want to play anything else. And here's the reality. Hypothetically, you're all adults, or you're probably high school age, maybe. Maybe in middle school. Maybe.
If you're in middle
But-
school, your parents will hate us.
Very likely, if you're listening to this podcast, you're an adult. And so, by that extension, the other people at the table should also be adults. But regardless, they are other people. And even though you have the title of GM, you are a player just as much as they are. You are not running this for their benefit. You should be running this as a group activity that you are participating in. You are a player. Just because you're called the Game Master does not change that. You, as the Game Master, are supposed to be having fun. If you're not having fun, that is the one time you are playing the game wrong. Everybody is supposed to have fun. So, when you're in that situation, you need to come to that point of like, we're going to have a talk. I am not enjoying this system. I think I'm just kind of burnt out on D&D or insert other system here. I would very much like to try something different. And maybe for you, it could be you still love fantasy. You want to do fantasy, but god damn, D&D's just fucking getting your goat. And it's just really frustrating to you. You can sit there and be like, look, I'm cool with doing fantasy if you guys don't want to do anything else. I love fantasy, but I don't want to do D&D anymore. I'm just really frustrated with the system. And if you want to discuss why you're frustrated with the system, you can. That's totally up to you. Because chances are they might want to know why. And it could be maybe there's a couple rulings that with some house rules you can fix. But if it's really that deep to the point that you feel like you need to change systems, house rules probably aren't going to fix it and are probably not the answer. And you can sit there and there are other fantasy systems out there. Maybe for the most part you do like it, but a switch to Pathfinder is what you need. Or a switch to Earth Dawn.
Or fuck, switch to a different D&D system. Jump to 3.5. Especially if you want a little more texture to your game.
Yeah. Which is why I said Pathfinder, because it's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
But better. But that's a conversation you can and should have if you're reaching that burnout point with a system. Because outside of studying the rules and all this other stuff, that's another way you can get burned out. Is you just don't like the fucking system and you want to do something else. Trust me, been there. I can run D&D 5th all day, any day. It's super fucking easy for me to run. It's pretty brain dead in that regard for me. But I don't really care for the system. I'd really prefer not to. And if my players were like, we want to play D&D, we want to play D&D, I would fucking... No, I just wouldn't. I would probably run some shorter adventures here and there, but I would not do full campaigns because get a little tired of it. So that's my last major one that I can think of a source of burnout. Be able to have that conversation, be able to foster that kind of communication with your players on the regular, of being able to discuss what are we enjoying, are we feeling like there's any pain points, or has it been all good so far. And that way, when you have fostered that kind of communication of how are we feeling about the game, does anybody have any comments or questions or anything at the end of the session, stuff like that, when you foster that kind of environment, it becomes a lot easier that, heaven forbid, you do reach that point of I really don't like this system. It is a lot easier to have that conversation because now you have that foundation, you have that groundwork and that expectation of being able to communicate. And people, it also won't feel necessarily out of left field because if you're having that level of communication, you've probably already mentioned to that point some things that you have issues with. So yeah, Communicate. Don't put yourself in a box just because everybody else is having fun. Your fun does not have to. Their fun does not have to come at the expense of your fun. Everybody should be having fun. So don't kill yourself over that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or
I really
any other
don't.
ways of burnout you can think of.
Like the primary one that I think of is like issues with scheduling. That shit gets tiring. Constantly having to get that sorted.
That's true. Yeah, scheduling definitely is a headache. That's really a group to group thing, and for some groups may be a little bit more hardcore about it. Some groups, not so much. Some groups, they literally do not have a consistent day. They meet once a month, and they have to figure it out every month. What day are we meeting? What time? Well, Shelly's got to take her kid to soccer practice. Tom's got a business meeting on X, X, and X. You know, so, but I mean, I've been in groups where, as long as 2 to 3 players show up, the session's happening. Whoever doesn't show up doesn't get experience points. Just flat out. And just that's how it is. And there is a reason given for why their characters are not present. And there is the set time every week on a set day. And that's how it goes. And then sometimes if a session is missed, there's a makeup session that is worked out to have the session on instead to make up for missing a session. Or some groups just say, "Oh, we can't meet this week. We'll just meet next week, same time, whatever." But if whatever method your group is doing is not working for you and it's becoming a point of frustration, say something.
Yeah.
See if there's something you can do to change it. If you can't change it, unfortunately, because of a lot of people's schedules, obviously, a lot of people are going to prioritize things over D&D. Like, most people do not have that kind of flexibility in their schedule to really move things around to go play D&D or whatever. Or just RPGs in general. So the reality is, if you can't get your preferred group of people together to play a game, you might want to see if it's one person causing a problem. Be like, hey, no hard feelings, but you can't regularly be there, so we're just going to go with us. Or you can have them show up as like guest characters here and there. That could be a solution. And otherwise, you just move on with the people that can be consistently be there. But if you can't even get that, you might have to just find a new group of people that more suit your needs.
Yeah.
If your preferred group are people who only if the people you want to play with are not matching your schedule preferences, like they only have time to play once a month, and it's variable when that is, but you want to consistently, I want to play every weekend, one day every weekend for like 4 hours, you're going to have to find another group. And they can be found online. There are lots of different communities and stuff out there to find people. Like on Reddit, there's RLFG. I know there are Facebook groups that are based off of areas. If you want to meet in person, I don't really use Facebook, so I don't have any like places to name drop. But if you go looking, you will find them. Almost certainly. As well as another great way of finding tables. A lot of people don't think about, if you have Discord, get Discord to do this method, but find which game system it is that you want to play or run a game in, especially if you want to run a game in and you need players. You'll get them no problem. Go to the official Discord or community of like a fan ran community Discord for whatever system it is you want to run. They will almost always have an LFG channel for finding players. Almost always. Now, over Discord, it'll be a little harder to find people to your area if you want to play in person, but if you're cool with playing online, absolutely a way of going about it. And there are virtual tabletops if you want to have, like, battle maps and stuff that you want to do online. Roll20, Foundry, so on and so forth. So if the scheduling is really killing you, sometimes you might have to change what you're doing, because scheduling is one of those things where it's the most annoying, inflexible part of the hobby that we have no real control over, because everything else ends up getting prioritized over it.
That's just an unfortunate part of the hobby, is that some people have the time realistically to partake in the hobby. Other people want to, but life gets in the way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But anything closing on this that you want to go over?
I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to the prep itself, if coming up with stuff yourself is something that really scares you and you're really unsure about, they have the, store bought is just fine option of pre-made adventures.
Yep.
You want to fucking, I don't know, do you like Curse of Strahd or whatever? Go fight a fucking powerful vampire. You got Curse of Strahd. You want to fight a big nasty dragon? Well, I actually don't even remember the name of that fucking adventure. But you got like Rime of the Frost Maiden, and other such stuff out there. There's both official pre-made adventures and fan-made pre-made adventures for all kinds of systems out there. Some of them are grander campaigns, some of them are shorter, some of them are more akin to one-shots. Go look around, you'll find them. Especially using some of that terminology we've been using. You will almost certainly find what you're looking for. Drive-through RPG can be a good place to find things that are even fan created, especially if you don't feel good about taking things for free. A lot of fan stuff on there is paid or pay what you want. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with using a pre-made adventure. And my only advice for those, I don't know if we're really going to have a episode really talking about pre-mades. So like my short advice for using those would just be, do not marry yourself to the written material. If your players go off the rails a little bit or you decide to change some details, once again, you're the GM. You are empowered to do that. There's nothing in that book that says, regardless of the adventure, that you have to run it word for word the exact way it's detailed out in the book. You can change what needs to be changed. And from what I understand, they typically keep them pretty open to a degree.
Yeah, it depends
They
on
might have
what
a
you're
degree
running.
of scripting in it. Yeah, they might have a degree of scripting in it, but there is generally breathing room to do things certain ways, to allow you room to thrive as a GM. So there's different opinions on pre-made adventures. Me personally, I'm like, my take is to create your own thing because you have total control and mastery over that. Some people are fucking horrified by that concept because it's a lot of work. I'm a world builder though, I really enjoy that. So
Yeah.
some people may thrive more with something pre-made for their first game. Something to consider if you're going to be going for a big grand scale campaign for your first game, you might want to start with something pre-made and build from there. But yeah, I think and I kind of sprinkled in some of our tips and what we did, both sprinkle in tips and tricks throughout.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Uh,
aside from that, just get out there and do it.
just get out there and do it.
Just do it and learn and get better, and maybe one day you'll do a podcast telling people how to go out there and just do it and get better. And then they'll go out there and make a podcast.
The cycle continues.
Yes.
But I want to thank everybody for listening. This is definitely more curated content to people that are looking for this. So if you stuck around and had no intent on GMing, well, congratulations. You now know a portion of what it's like being a GM.
Yeah. Also, if you're not a GM and you have no intention of being a GM, be nicer to your GM.
Yes.
Like, even if you don't say it every time, but thank you every once in a while would go a long way.
Buy them a coffee.
Or or bring them snacks or whatever. Like, if you're playing in person, anyways.
One day.
Yeah. Like, while they are supposed to have fun too, and they are hopefully enjoying themselves, they are, generally speaking, putting in more work than the players. So, give them a little bit of respect. And that's not coming from a biased standpoint as a GM, but just like, common courtesy.
Common courtesy. It's all we're mentioning. But thank you for listening. Hope to have you on the next one. Bye.
Dude.